Hello, I'm David Ramsden. I'm the Chief Executive at the Trust, and I know I've met a number of you in recent times. It's been a long time since we've been able to speak together physically, and I look forward to that before too long. I really want to welcome you to the first CF Live event we're doing of 2022. It's a series of events that we've got into a really positive habit of doing now, which I hope engages and informs around key issues. And it's so fantastic that we're able to start the year on such a positive topic, which we thought would be really useful to explore a little bit in depth about what the announcements of a couple of weeks ago really mean for now and in the future. I have a little bit of admin to do, which is please do keep your cameras and your microphones muted. As many of you will be aware, we gathered questions in advance and we'll be posing a number of them later in the call. If you have other questions that you want to ask, please do put them in the chat or communicate with us in other ways, because we're conscious that there will be things that crop up during this conversation that will prompt thoughts, and there's obviously a limited amount of time that we have in this particular session because we are going to finish it promptly at 1:30. You'll hear from a number of speakers today, and I'll leave them to introduce themselves as we move through the agenda. But also I want to emphasize is we've just had the verbal warning. We're recording this event so that we can reshare for those people who want to watch again or who weren't able to participate, and can add to our library of information that we're putting out on key topics. But thanks again for giving up your time on this Thursday lunchtime, and I look forward to spending the next hour or so with you. So in advance of this session, I started to reflect on actually a milestone I've just passed, which was in the start of December. It was 5 years since I've been Chief Executive of the Trust. And I vividly remember the autumn of 2016 when I started to prepare my application and hearing this word "Orkambi" repeatedly stated. I met when I joined the Trust, this incredible community, and I feel proud to have been part of it over these last 5 years or so. What I found myself joining, though, was a real fight, and that fight was for access to medicines, in that case, or can be, as the one that was licensed at that point in time. And I just want to say at the start of today, I don't think we should lose sight of how awful it was that the community and people with cystic fibrosis were put in the position where they had to organise with the Trust and other partners to campaign for a medicine and medicines that would help change their lives. And I don't think any condition or patient group should ever be in that situation where it falls to them to campaign for access to medicines that can have such a significant influence. But you did. The campaign was exceptional. We put one slide up there, but the scale of letters, the scale of petitions, the numerous debates we had in Westminster and across the four devolved nations, because this was a proper UK-wide effort and involved even the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man to get to where we needed to get to. And there were demonstrations, lots of demonstrations. And interestingly, when I was looking at this slide earlier, I remember lots of snowy demonstrations, but clearly there were also some sunny demonstrations. But people right across the community supported in the way they could to make sure that the voice of people with cystic fibrosis was heard. But on the way, Symkevi, the next drug, was approved, but not funded. But then the campaign continued to build momentum as we started to hear about some amazing trial results for what we were then calling Trikafta, coming out of the States. And then obviously we now know as Kaftrio. And then we came to autumn 2019, which seemed a long time ago in many ways, but was a really significant breakthrough when, for the first time, Orkambi and Symkevi were funded on the NHS in the four nations of the United Kingdom. That broke the dam, and it meant that over the next few months, when the negotiations were moving forward for Kaftrio, there was a level of negotiating dynamic that meant in June 2020, we got the fantastic news that a comprehensive deal had been done for access to Kaftrio. It's important that that deal was absolutely critical because it had clauses in it in all 4 nations that anticipated and accounted for an extension by age and an extension by mutation where those arose through the licensing arrangements. That means that at this stage, we don't need to do another campaign for how these medicines are funded because it's part of the existing deal that's in place, which I really just want to emphasize. Every letter that was written, every signature that went on a petition, every single action you took, but critically, every story that was told and every life story that was brought to life was absolutely fundamental to getting to where we are today. And I just want to, again, I can't tell you how proud I am to be alongside you in getting to this point. This is a special moment. You know, the start of 2022 is a special moment, and we want to note, and I think I will say celebrate it, but we also recognise that this is a journey that we're on as we seek to take change for people with cystic fibrosis forward. But it is an important step. But we won't stop until everybody with cystic fibrosis is able to live a life where they're physically well, mentally well, and truly fulfilled. We have a very clear vision about people being able to live a long and full life. And we are dedicated to ensure that through treatment and other support, the trust is there for the long haul. But I don't want to underestimate what a big step this is, able for people in the age group of 6 to 11 to access this medicine. And I'm going to hand over to Keith, who's going to talk about the medicine itself, what it does, what we can hope from it, and then we'll go through different stages about what happens next. So thank you for joining again, and I look forward to answering some of the questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Keith Brownlee. I'm Director of Medical Affairs at the Trust. And like David, I've been sort of reflecting on my journey in this. I first became involved in the care of children and families with cystic fibrosis as a paediatrician in Leeds in 1984. And I was involved in the care in 2012 when ivacaftor or Kalydeco was introduced, the first highly effective modulator. And the remarkable improvement was just staggering, but it only applied to around 4 to 5% of people with CF. And to get to this stage, 10 years later, where there's a highly effective modulator available for children over 6 years of age, for over 90%, probably more like 95% of people with CF, is staggering. Certainly the improvements over the last 10 years in treatment available for CF have been greater than in the previous 30 years. And as David has said, we absolutely understand that some people can't benefit from these treatments, and we are determined to work with our partners and to leave no stones unturned to make sure that they get access to treatments which work for them. Next slide, please. So as David said, last week, the European Medicines Agency and the UK equivalent, the MHRA, confirmed an extension to the license for Kaftrio to include children 6 to 11 years old, which is just absolutely fantastic news. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what Kaftrio is. The clue is in the name, I suppose. It's a combination of the 3 medicines above, elexacaftor, tezacaftor, and ivacaftor. But I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. I'm going to talk about who's eligible under the licensing agreements. I'm going to talk about the paper that those licensing agreements were based on and show you some of the results and some of the benefits of Kaftrio. And I'm going to talk briefly at the end about how we're supporting those individuals who can't benefit from Kaftrio for whatever reason. Next slide, please. Okay, so you will all be very familiar with this, I'm absolutely sure, but traditionally, cystic fibrosis treatment has involved treating the consequences of having cystic fibrosis. So that by that I mean over years and decades, people with CF have problems with their airways, the tubes that they breathe through. So they become clogged up with stickier mucus. They get infections in those biofilms or the mucus, which result in airway inflammation and result in dilatation of the airway and thickening of the airway. Now, treatments have been aimed at trying to overcome those problems. So physiotherapy is trying to clear those sticky mucus. Mucolytics such as DNAs, hypertonic saline, and others such as mannitol help by breaking down the mucus and make sure that you can cough it up and clear those secretions. Antibiotics have been really important in terms of preventing infection, eradicating infection, and treating exacerbations or flare-ups. And in some cases, anti-inflammatory medicines as well. Now, they've all been good and they've resulted in phenomenal improvements in outcomes for people with CF. But we now have medications, the modulators, the highly effective modulators that actually target the underlying defect, if you like. So Kaftrio works by its impact on the chloride channel. Now, people with cystic fibrosis, as you, I'm sure, know, don't have as much or as effective chloride channel as they should have on the cell membranes. So normally, the iron chloride leaves the cell and ensures that the liquid on the surface of the cell and the secretions are fluid and can be coughed up and can be mobilized. But if you have cystic fibrosis, either you don't have any of that chloride channel on the cell membrane, or you have very little, or it doesn't work very well. Now, these modulators work in two ways. First, the potentiator, like either Kaftrio or Kalydeco, works by improving the effectiveness of that channel, so allows more chloride to leave the cell. And then the correctors, the other two drugs in the combination, work by stopping the channel being broken down inside the cell and ensure that more of the channel gets to the cell surface. So the important thing about this is it's addressing the fundamental problem with cystic fibrosis, not treating the consequences of having CF. And that's so important. But I'd like to emphasize that at this point, we are adding these drugs to our armamentarium for treating CF. It's not a replacement. Next slide, please. So who is eligible? Well, clearly, if you have a diagnosis of cystic fibrosis and you are over 6 years of age, then you are eligible for these treatments if you have 2 508 mutations or 1 508 mutation and any other CF-causing mutation. And as I've said before, this is over 90% of people with cystic fibrosis and is a very broad eligibility. Next slide, please. I wanted to talk a little bit about the benefits that we can expect. Now, clearly, these are still relatively new drugs, even in the adult world, and for children over the age of 12. But for children under the age of 12, between 6 and 11, this is the study that the licensing agreement was informed by. So when they talked about licensing these medications, they looked at all of the evidence in the adult studies and in the older children studies, but also this study. And I'd like to run through this with you in a little bit of detail, just to explain some of the benefits that they recognized in this study. But first, I'd like to point out it isn't a controlled trial, it's an open label study. So basically that means that they took a group of around 66 children in that age category with either 2 508 mutations or a 508 plus any other mutation, and monitored them before introducing treatment, and then they started the treatment and followed those children up for 24 weeks to see what the outcome was of starting the drug. And these are the results. So this is a graph looking at lung function or percent predicted FEV1. Now, you'll all be very familiar with lung function in clinic. And you will also be very familiar that most younger children, certainly under the age of 12, have very good lung function. And in fact, in this study, I think the average FEV1 was 89% at the start of the study. So these were a group of well children on the whole. And despite all already being well, if you like, the improvement in lung function was staggering. So you can see a rapid improvement from baseline up to around 9%, and then a continued improvement through to 24 weeks of the study. And I think the improvement, the mean improvement, was just over 10%, despite the initial FEV1 nearly being 90%, which is staggering. And just, when you look at other drugs that have been introduced into CF care over the last 10, 15 years, that kind of improvement of 10% is remarkable. Next slide, please. Well, I should also mention, actually, in terms of lung function, I haven't got a slide for it, but there was a very significant improvement in lung clearance index as well, which is another even more sensitive measure of lung function, and showed a similar kind of improvement. The other outcome measure was quality of life, roughly relating to symptoms. And again, the same kind of graph, if you like. There was a baseline of 0 and then an improvement of around about, I think it was 7 points as an average, and a clinically significant improvement is anything more than 4 points. So a high start, again, similar to the lung function, of around about 80, 100 being as good as you can get, and a significant improvement of 7 over the course of the study. And as you can see, that continued up to 24 weeks. Next slide, please. We've heard a lot in the adult and the older children studies about the improvement in nutrition. And it's true that we don't really know why there's such a big improvement in nutrition when these drugs are started. But in the children 6 to 11 age category, we saw a very similar thing. These two graphs relate to weight in absolute terms. So again, at baseline, there was 0 change, but towards the end of the study, there was up to a 3 kilo mean change in weight, which is staggering. And many of you will recognize that from your attendance, as clinic has been a fantastic weight gain over a 24-week period, but also more generally in terms of nutrition and BMI, a significant improvement throughout the course of the study. Again, reflecting what we're seeing in older children and in adults. Next slide, please. One of the other really, really interesting, and I suspect to some extent, a little bit unanticipated effect of these treatments, at the very beginning at least, was the impact on sweat test. As you're all aware, the sweat test is the diagnostic test for CF. And if you've got a value of over 60, then you're in the diagnostic CF category. But these drugs actually alter the nature of the sweat test result. And these two graphs look at the two groups that were in the pediatric study, those with a 508 mutation and a minimal function mutation on the left, and those with 2 508 mutations on the right. And the two different colors represent the sweat chloride value. And as you can see, 100% of people had a sweat chloride value of less than 60 in those who had 2 508 mutations, and 42% had a sweat chloride value absolutely in the normal range, less than 30. Whereas for those who had a 508 and a minimal function mutation, you can see similar improvements, certainly in terms of the less than 60 diagnostic category. So these drugs are having, as I said at the very beginning, a remarkable effect on the basic cause of cystic fibrosis, and that's evidenced by the response to the sweat test to these medications. Next slide, please. I know people often ask about side effects, and that's a really important question to ask about any medications, but I've taken some of the quotes out of the studies to try to address those questions. In the study I've been talking about, it was said that the medications were generally safe and well tolerated, although it must be said that there wasn't a control group for direct comparison, but nonetheless, they're safe and well tolerated. The safety profile in children 6 to 11 years old was absolutely consistent with the excellent safety profile for children over 12 years of age. As many of you will be aware, when you're involved in a study, any new symptom or new occurrence is reported as an AE or an adverse event. And most of the adverse events reported were absolutely consistent with the symptoms that you'd expect somebody with CF to have, or the symptoms consistent with a common childhood infection. So nothing to suggest that they were related in any way to the medication. Rashes, headaches and fevers were reported, but these were generally mild to moderate, and the vast majority were transient and resolved spontaneously with time, and didn't result in stopping treatment. In fact, I think in the whole study, there was only one child that actually stopped treatment. Next slide, please. So I said at the beginning, I'll talk a little bit about those who are not eligible or won't benefit from Kaftrio. And clearly one of those groups, at the moment at least, is children under 6 years of age. Now, again, I suspect a number of you will be familiar that there are trials open in the 2 to 5 year age group, looking at the benefits and the potential side effects of these treatments in that younger age group. They're recruiting at the moment, and I'm sure they'll be reporting in the near future. It'd be really interesting to see those results. So fingers crossed that it'll all go smoothly and quickly. Post-transplant, clearly people who've had a transplant may not benefit to the same extent as those who haven't. One of the problems with transplanting is the immunosuppression interacts potentially with some of these medications and makes it more difficult to get the right levels of the immunosuppression. And obviously, if you've had a lung transplant, then the medications won't work in the lung tissue that's been implanted. But nonetheless, having said that, there's increasing experience of using these drugs in some people post-transplant. And I think we need to see more literature on that, but it's definitely an interesting field. I mentioned at the beginning that more than 90% and possibly up to 95% of people will benefit from these medications, but there is a small percentage who won't, either because they have the genetics that result in no protein getting to the being manufactured at all and getting to the cell surface, or they just have a mutation that produces a protein that's not responsive to the treatments. And there's lots of ongoing research looking for different modulators from different companies that work in slightly different ways. And finally, intolerant of the currently available drugs. This is uncommon. There's definitely some cases of people who are intolerant for a variety of reasons, but there's many different strategies that the clinicians use to try to cope with that and try to overcome the intolerance, including occasionally stopping the medication and restarting them at a low dose, or just going to a low dose, and other strategies as well. So although it does happen, it's quite uncommon, and hopefully as new modulators come through, that'll be another way of overcoming some of these issues. Next slide, please. Both David and I have talked a little bit about those who can't benefit from the currently available highly effective modulators, and we're absolutely determined to ensure that that group of people get access to treatments that work for them. One element of that is funding a balanced portfolio of research. And I ask you to look at the CF Trust website and look at the research that's being funded. And amongst that, there is research for gene editing and other things that will hopefully benefit people who don't benefit from the current modulators available. The Clinical Trials Accelerator is an initiative by the Trust, which has been around now for several years, and it's been absolutely fantastic in sort of smoothing the process and facilitating the process of clinical trials in the UK. And as I've mentioned, there's a trial recruiting at the moment that's on the Trials Accelerator program, the 2 to 5 year age range. We continue to work with our clinical partners to drive up improvements in general care, and that includes all sorts of different elements of general care, which continues to remain really important for everybody. And we work with partnerships in partnering organisations throughout the world and the UK in funding other research and jointly funding research and trying to find new innovations for everybody with CF, and we'll continue to do that. Next slide. So that's the end of my talk, but I will be available to answer questions later. I'd now like to hand over to my good friend and colleague, Professor Kevin Southern. Kevin works in Liverpool, and he is one of the drivers behind two key studies, CF Storm and CF Start, which are looking at sort of other elements of care other than modulators. Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Keith, for that really good presentation and the background. And thanks, David and Nicola, for organising this event and for asking me to come along. They've asked me to talk a bit more about the practicalities of starting on the triple therapy, which I'll call Kaftrio, and what it will mean for you and for your young ones. It's a very interesting time and obviously a very exciting time. One of the questions that we've had a few questions come through. One of the questions is when can we expect to start the triple therapy? And the commissioners, who are the people in charge of deciding which drugs we're going to have access to, have said that they want the triple therapy to be rolled out in the next 3 months for children aged 6 to 11. And as CF teams, we're really confident that we can do that easily, and we would hope to roll it out a lot quicker. Our CF teams around the country will be prioritising. Obviously, there will be some children in this age group who don't enjoy such good condition, and we'll be prioritising them, obviously. But we would expect to roll this out over the next 6 weeks or so, because we've already got the infrastructure in place. We've been providing this type of drug for our 12 years and older patients who are eligible for over a year, and so the systems are in place. The systems are a bit different in that the commissioners have asked that these drugs, which cost quite a bit of money, are actually provided to families by what we call home care companies or home care providers, and these are companies around the country. So to get the triple therapy, you'll need to be registered with a home care provider, and we will organise that as a CF team, and it's essentially a paper form, and many CF teams have already been on this and have got these filled out. Many of you will have children who are already on modulators, who are on Symkevi, because they've got 2 copies of the F508 DAL mutation, the Delta F508 variant that Keith talked about. So they're already registered with the home care company, and transferring that prescription is really quite straightforward. And so that will happen hopefully in a very prompt way. But there are going to be quite a large number of children and families who have not had access to modulator therapy to date, because they've only got 1 Delta F508 mutation, and obviously because they're naive to this sort of therapy, we'll be prioritizing them as well and trying to get them established on this, and they'll need to be registered. It's not a complicated process, and your CF team will coordinate that. The good thing is, once you're registered, then you don't have to do repeat prescriptions, and the drugs are delivered to your home. So it's a really good service, and that's great. So hopefully, by the spring, we'll have established this age group on this triple therapy, and that's very exciting. One of the questions I've had in my clinic, and one of the questions that has come through to this meeting is, well, if my child is already on Symkevi, the dual therapy of Taser, Kaftrio, Ivacaftor, and they're doing quite well, as many of them are, should I go on to the triple therapy? Should I make that change? My advice would be, absolutely you should. We're looking at a therapy here which is 2 as, 3 times as, even possibly 4 times more effective than the dual therapy. So we're looking at a magnitude of effectiveness that is significantly more. And I've had many long conversations with some of our families around, our child's doing very well. Should they go on Orkambi? Should they go on to the Symkevi? Because they're doing very well, and these are new therapies. And some families have made the decision to hold off for a while and just sort of see how things pan out. Because at the end of the day, these are new drugs. But for this triple therapy, I would strongly recommend that you start it as soon as it's available for you, because this is a really transformational therapy. We've seen that in the adult population, and now we've seen it in our young adults as well, at 12 years and over. And what we've seen has been at times really quite remarkable, and the stories have been very nice. And I'm sure you have maybe looked at social media and read some of the really heartwarming stories that have come through from adults talking about the fact that they no longer have a productive cough, they no longer have struggle gaining weight, and they haven't been in hospital for a year. These kind of stories have come through. But I have to say that many of the children whose parents are on this call are very well, and for that cohort, you might not find a dramatic change as you establish your young one on the triple therapy, because actually you're in a different place, to a different part of your CF journey to where these adults are. So I think you need to be aware of that. And if you become established on the triple therapy and you haven't felt an overriding change in your condition or your child's condition, you might reflect on that and think, well, do I need to be on this therapy? Again, I would strongly suggest that you do, and you should continue it. And I do appreciate that taking therapies is difficult when you're not feeling a dramatic response. However, I think for the majority of your children and for you, you will notice changes, and the changes are quite interesting. And I talk to all the young people who come through who are established on triple therapy, and I ask them about all sorts of things, and some of the stories have been fascinating, not just around their respiratory function, and Keith's covered that, but around how they feel tummy wise. Many patients, when they become established on the triple therapy for around a week, describe being really quite productive of airway secretions. And this is something that the adult people describe in quite graphic detail, and they've called it the purge, and it's not really a term I like particularly much, but it is a good description of how they feel, that they're kind of purging out those airway secretions. I think that's less likely to happen in our children who have got really good respiratory condition, the younger children, but you may still see that. Some of our teenagers have described having rather uncomfortable feelings in their sinuses as the airway as the secretions into the sinuses improve, because this drug works on all the cells in your body. It's a systemic drug, it's a tablet, it's quite a big tablet, and we can talk about tablets later on. But these effects, the effects of the purge, the effects on the sinuses, the effects on other parts of the body, they're only transient, and after about a week it all settles down, and the patients feel really quite stable. So those are things to look out for. Work in partnership with your CF teams. This is going to be a really important period for you to reflect on a number of things, but particularly Keith was talking about the weight increases, which have been very significant. And this is a time when you probably need to work very closely with your CF team, in particular the dietitians, and talk to them about the good, healthy diets that you've established for your young people. And healthy eating will continue to be really key. But what you might find is that because we encourage a really very good and often fairly calorific diet, that your children's weights start to go up, and sometimes quite rapidly. So that needs to be kept an eye on, but good nutrition remains a key, as does exercise, as does all the things that you've been doing to keep your child well up to this point. I was talking before we started the meeting with some other people on the panel, saying, I say to our families that this is not the end of the CF journey. This is the start of a new journey. And what you have here is really the framework to be able to establish a really full, active and healthy adult life. Other treatments will come along eventually, but you really need to be engaging in all the things that you've done to keep your child really well for all these years, you still need to be doing those. Essentially, good nutrition and lots of really key activity and exercise. Those remain really important. So I'm going to hand over, because I don't want to eat too much more into Susan's time, and some of the things I've been asked to talk about, side effects and other things, but we'll maybe come back to that in the question and answer session that Esther's going to chair later. So I'm going to hand over to Susan now, who's a proper scientist who works with the CF Trust on their registry data.
Thanks, Kevin. That was really interesting to hear your individual and interesting comments from the families and people that you care for. As my title and role suggests, I work with the registry team on the data that you enter or give consent to enter onto the registry. And actually, my journey in terms of CF is very similar to David's in that respect. And I joined the Trust not long after David, in May 2017. And I remember the fight and the demonstrations and what you guys had to go through. So I'm going to briefly talk about that journey over the last 4 or 5 years, with a particular focus on how the registry data has impacted on where we are today. Now, in actual fact, we started using the great data that you get to give consent to enter on the registry. We started using that to monitor outcomes after going on to a CFTR modulator right back in 2012. And although that was reimbursed almost immediately in 2012, we started our first post-marketing safety study then on ivacaftor or Kaladicol. And that was a long-term study based on around 4 or 5 years of use of that drug. So the registry does have a very good history of supporting these types of studies. And then, as David mentioned, there was a bit of a fight going on from then onwards to get access to Orkambi and Symkevi with the open letter in 2016. And then the milestone point, I think David talked a landmark point, when the use of the registry to monitor the outcomes after being on CFTR modulators was agreed in 2019. And that's when we saw uptake of Orkambi and Symkevi. And obviously that data and outcomes after taking those drugs would have been entered onto the registry after taking the drug and right throughout 2020. And then crucially in 2020, because that registry solution was agreed way back then, and there were clauses in there that meant we could add to that data monitoring process, we could add the drugs as they came along for Kaftrio. And crucially, again, we were able to keep adding in the monitoring agreement for any license indications, which now means that we don't need to do these agreements again with Vertex and NICE for these 6 to 11-year-olds that have just been granted access. So crucially, the registry data has underpinned or played a very important part in this journey that we've gone through with you. Next slide, please, Danny. So why is the registry data so useful for this? Well, to be honest, as a lot of you who maybe deal with data a lot, and us statisticians are always saying the more data you've got, the better, right? It's just absolutely amazing, our registry. The fact that 99% of the people with CF in the UK give consent for their data to be entered on the registry. And why is that important? Well, partly because more data is best. And also we can monitor the outcomes and effects of these drugs for a long period of time, because we're collecting this data anyway. And the other thing that's really, really important, and possibly not really mentioned enough, is that this is real world data. So in other words, you are taking these drugs and we're monitoring the outcomes while you are taking all the other drugs and therapies that you need to look after yourself. So whereas clinical trials are often a much more restricted population, both in terms of numbers and what other drugs and therapies you might be on. So the advantage of the registries are mainly in terms of that. One of the other things is that the alternative to using the registry might mean that pharmaceutical companies might use other ways of collecting that data. And the registry has a policy of that we never ever send individual level data to the pharmaceutical companies that we collaborate with. So all our data is aggregate data. They never get access. Next slide, please. Thanks, Anna. So what have we learned so far? Well, as of many messages you might have come across in the last year or two, we've been monitoring these outcomes of these drugs during a global pandemic. So if you read the most recently published annual report from the registry, that's based on 2020 data. So that's our most recent data that we have the whole year of data for. In fact, your clinical teams are probably rapidly adding your final annual reviews onto the registry for the rest of this month, because we take our data log for the 2021 data at the end of January. So what did we learn from the 2020 data? Well, obviously the pandemic will make interpretation quite difficult, because we won't know for certain whether it's impact of modulators or COVID itself. And that's particularly true with regard to inpatient activity records and organ transplantation, for example. We won't know whether it's positive impact of Kaftrio or COVID, or perhaps a combination of the two. But the graph in the middle there does show you that as soon as Kaftrio was reimbursed in August 19, we saw a rapid uptake into December of that year. So you can see that in the orange bars at the top there. And you can also see how the switch from Lumacaftor, ivacaftor, and tezacaftor, ivacaftor in the browny color and the green colored bars as well. And you will see that graph in the annual report too. Next slide. So a bit of a plug for the annual report. If you want to know more and see more of the number crunching that goes on to get your annual report produced, and in fact potential changes that might have happened because of the COVID pandemic, we're doing a CF Live next week on the 25th of January, which does happen to be Burns Night. So there might be some refreshments. Maybe you want to bring some refreshments along as well while you're listening. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for continuing to give consent for your data to be entered on the registry. Thanks. I'm handing back to David now.
I'm a little concerned you're offering trust-funded whiskey. Let's make sure that's not our official policy. But thanks for that. Thanks to you, Keith and Kevin. And we're going to go into some questions. I know others have been put in the chat, and we've got 15 minutes or so now to address some of the ones that have come in, which we think will be pertinent. But we will also ensure that we address the other ones that have come in the chat, and we're collecting those. But I'm going to hand over to chair this session to Esther, who's going to introduce herself and then run through the questions.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Susan, for that really interesting snippet from the registry. So hi everyone, I'm Esther Valentine. I've been a volunteer at the Trust for the past few years. I'm also a CF mum to Joshua, who is 6 years old. He started Orkambi 2 years ago, and we've seen big improvements in his health. So we are really excited about starting Kaftrio, and it's just wonderful to see these life-changing drugs reaching even more of our CF community. So I've got a few questions that we'd like to ask our panel of experts. I think some of them have already been answered by Kevin, so I'll move to those that we've not answered quite yet. The first one is for you, Kevin. What tests need to be done before starting Kaftrio? Are there any extra tests that require hospital visits when you are already on Kaftrio?
So there are a number of baseline tests which you will organise with your CF team, and unfortunately these include some blood tests. So people who are already established on the Symkevi and Orkambi will be familiar with this. We like to measure the blood pressure. There have been no problems with blood pressure in the paediatric population, but in some of the adult patients on Orkambi, there was a signal of rising blood pressure. We don't understand that. We haven't seen that with the small children on Orkambi, but we have seen it more recently with the triple therapies. So blood pressure monitoring is important. Eye monitoring, so getting just a routine eye check at an optician is fine, and that needs to be done before you start. So and if your child wears glasses and gets an annual eye check, that's fine as well. The reason for that is in the ivacaftor preclinical study. So whenever a new drug comes along, it's tested on animal models to check that there's no obvious safety signals before moving into human studies. And in some of the juvenile animals that were used for those studies, they found some type of slight cataracts in the animals that were on the ivacaftor. This wasn't translated then into the clinical studies. But in some of the larger clinical studies of the ivacaftor, which goes back like 8 years now, there were some eye changes found, but that was the same in both the group who weren't on ivacaftor and the group who are on ivacaftor. So it's probably more reflection of having cystic fibrosis. But I think getting the eye checks is a good idea, and then getting them checked annually once you're on the triple therapy is a good idea. And then the blood tests are routine blood tests looking at standard things, but mainly focusing on the liver function tests. And in a very small number of people, there's been some rise in some of the measures that we look at on the blood tests that gives an indicator of how your liver's doing. So those are the standard baseline tests, and we repeat those at 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, and then annually thereafter. Appreciate that is quite a lot of testing for these young people, some of whom are not so used to having blood tests, but I think it's really important. Do you want me to talk briefly about side effects? It's very safe. These preparations are proven to be very safe with a very good safety profile, and we haven't seen much in the way of side effects, apart from in a very small number of patients, less than sort of 1 in 100, they've had to discontinue the therapy because of either raised liver function tests or sometimes unusual things like rashes that don't settle. But generally speaking, these drugs in the adults have been very well tolerated. The data from the pediatric studies suggest that they're as well, if not even better tolerated in that age group. So I think the safety profile is looking good, but it's a new drug and we need to be aware of that. We need to be cognizant of that. We need to be looking out for unusual things. So if something unusual happens, you need to discuss that with your CF team, and the CF team will record that nationally, because we want to gain more data about these drugs.
Brilliant, thanks, Kevin. And the next question is also for you, Kevin. Life expectancy and Kaftrio. What changes can we expect to see in this age group?
So I think I covered this in my waffle earlier on, but I was saying that this is a new journey, and I think the framework is really exciting. But I think, and we've had a few questions coming through about, can we be seen less often in the clinic? Can we stop some nebulized therapies? I think for the time being, the approach should be that you carry on with what you were doing before. If you're on nebulized therapies, we certainly haven't got robust evidence that the triple therapy has an impact on microbiology. So, for example, if you have chronic airway infection, which very few children in this age group do have, then we haven't got evidence that that's going to go away. But actually, there's a little bit of evidence coming through that things improve. So we have to be careful about stopping therapies, but we are really aware that the reducing treatment load and burden is something that's really important to families. So over time, that might be something that we evolve to be able to say, well, yeah, maybe we can see you less often, maybe we can reduce the nebulized Dornase alpha. Keith talked about the CF STORM study. That's a STORM in a trial in adults and older children, and that's looking at whether stopping Dornase alpha is safe in that age group, and that trial's ongoing at the moment. Was there another question? That was about life expectancy. So yeah, it looks, the data from this trial looks very good, but I think that we will still need things coming through in the future. And I don't know if people listen to the North American CF conference in the autumn of last year, but it's very reassuring that there's still a wealth of research, and David and Keith have talked about that as well, what they're supporting here. So that's important, that's going on, because in 10, 15 years time, if new therapies come along, maybe stem cell therapies, things like that, that's going to be very important for your cohort. But this treatment will really make a difference to get you to that point in as good a shape as possible.
Brilliant. Yeah, sounds really promising, Kevin. So moving on to the next question then. For children that have been colonized, do we expect to see an improvement on Kaftrio, even a potential eradication of infection?
I don't know the answer to that yet. I've kind of alluded to that last time, Esther, and I think the safe thing is to carry on with your nebulized antibiotic and keep monitoring. I mean, if one of our young children goes for, say, a year without growing Pseudomonas or whatever bug they're growing, then we'll often talk to the family about the potential for stopping the nebulized antibiotic. But for the time being, don't change any of the treatments that you're on at the moment.
Sure, makes sense. And one for Keith. How soon do you think the trials will be available for the 3 to 6 year olds?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just briefly to add to Kevin's point on the last question as well, just to emphasize that a lot of these studies are really short term, and it's difficult to know some of the answers to those questions. But I think what is evident, there is an improvement in the microbiology in the airway, although there's not a lot of evidence to support eradication, perhaps a bit more evidence to support lack of acquisition of new infection. But I think the information is going to become available through registry-based studies as we go forward. Going on to that last question, as I mentioned in the talk, there's a study underway for the 2 to 5 year age group, the next category down. It's recruiting at the present time, and that will be available and published some point in the next year or so, I would guess. So it's in the cooker, it's being prepared.
Brilliant, thanks Keith. I think that's really positive. Now, I think they're all the kind of ready-made questions I had available, so perhaps we could move on to choose some questions from the chat.
There's a question about NTM, and I'm afraid we don't have data on NTM, and NTM, or sometimes called Mycobacterium abscessus, difficult infection in many older people with CF and some children. So I think what Keith says, that this is correcting the underlying issue with secretions in the airways, and I think that it's almost certainly going to have a benefit on chronic airway infection, and maybe make it easier for us to be able to work with the families to treat those infections. So I don't have much information on that, I'm afraid, but I'm possibly more confident that this will enable children with recurrent ABPA, which is an allergic lung issue, to have better control, and because the underlying CF defect is being corrected, I'm quite confident that that's going to have quite a profound impact on ABPA. That's my hope. We haven't got a lot of data to support that, but I'm quite confident. Then there's a question about the pancreas. The impact on the pancreas is really interesting for some of our. So the pancreas has, as you know, two functions. One, to help you absorb your food with the enzymes, and that's why the children take the enzyme replacement therapy, the Creon, but also to secrete insulin into the bloodstream to control the blood sugar. And although the vast majority of our children that we look after require pancreatic enzymes, in this age group, having sugar intolerance or a lack of insulin is unusual. But for our older patients, that what we call CF-related diabetes is much more prevalent, much more common, and those adult patients who have gone on to triple therapy have found that their blood sugar control has improved. It's and actually it's obviously the triple therapy is having a beneficial impact on the pancreas, and it's able to secrete more insulin. Actually, what we found in young adults is that because they kind of have been, they haven't got diabetes and their pancreas is fine from that perspective, but because they're always really good at pushing out insulin to control their diets, actually some of them have been feeling a bit hypo and a bit low in blood sugar. So that's something to just bear in mind as your child's going to school in the first few weeks of going on to the triple therapy, that actually they might feel those sort of hypo feelings. Not dangerous at all. They're not going to collapse. It's not like a diabetic patient, but they might just need to have a Snickers bar. Well, they won't eat Snickers bars because no children do they? But they might need something in their pocket to sort of just take if they're feeling a bit sort of woozy. We monitor our older children quite carefully going on to Kaftrio. We actually put a long-term blood sugar monitor, a Libra probe on to see how the blood sugar is doing that, and many CF centres are doing that. But that's just something to be aware of.
I have another question here, Kevin. What if my child won't swallow tablets? Is there an alternative?
Not at the moment. So the trials in the 2 to 5 year olds are looking at granules. The tablets, actually I went on the web to see if I could see some tablets. I've actually got the sizes of the tablets somewhere. So the full dose tablet is I think quite a big tablet. But most children take the tablets very well. The half dose tablet for the less than 30 kilos, and not, I guess some of your children will be less than 30 kilos. The half dose tablet is not too big. It's about 6 millimeters in width. But if you go onto the web, and if you put Trikafta, which is the American name for Kaftrio, if you put Trikafta patient information in, you can find some pictures of the tablets. So if your child struggles taking tablets and capsules, then obviously you've been doing a lot of work with your team to try and sort of support you in getting through this. And pharmacists are developing, and psychologists are developing some really good strategies to try and take tablets. And you should talk to your CF team and to your pharmacists about ways that they can support you in taking tablets.
Is there any option to crush the tablets at all?
No, please don't crush the tablets. So you need to take the tablet as the tablet is, but have a chat with your team and with your pharmacist, and it may be that they can support you in doing that. But if you change a tablet's shape or crush it, it changes the way the tablet works. So you have to be careful about that. And many of you will be aware that actually you need to take, there's 2 tablets to take in the morning, so the triple therapy and the ivacaftor, and then in the evening you just take the ivacaftor, the Kalydeco. When you take these tablets, they're better absorbed with fat and with creon, with the enzymes. The enzymes help the absorption, but you have to have a fairly good amount of fat in the breakfast to absorb the tablets. Many of you will be familiar with this. I have to say some of our teenagers aren't great at taking breakfast, but I think your younger ones should probably be good with their breakfast. But for some of our teenagers, we've actually given them the large dose, the triple therapy, in the evening when they're more awake and able to take a bigger meal. I think sorry, I've talked too long. See that, yeah.
I just want to thank you, Esther, for sharing that. I think we're coming up to time now, but also want to thank everyone who submitted a question and as I said earlier, we will ensure that all of those questions are responded to. The plan is that we will post the recording on Monday, which hopefully will get a wider audience beyond those who joined us today. And again, really, it's a fantastic turnout we had today. We really appreciate you all giving up your time. Also, I do want to reiterate Susan's plug about the event we've got on Tuesday evening, which is looking at the registry. It's also going to be talking about the project that we've got in terms of refreshing our research priorities, and which we really would welcome your insights into. But I just want to finish again by thanking all the speakers, but really thanking all of you. This is a special moment to mark a really important step in the journey that we are all continuing on together. And I really look forward to that, continuing to pick up pace in the weeks and months ahead as we unite for a life unlimited. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.